Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Dr. Vera Castellanos, and 18 months ago, I never would have believed that information could be predatory. I spent 12 years as an archivist for the Mendelssohn Institute, a private research foundation in Connecticut that specialized in acquiring obscure historical documents. And in all that time, I'd handled everything from Revolutionary War correspondence to sealed psychiatric records from the 1950s. Paper was paper. Words were words. Information was inert, waiting to be discovered, cataloged, preserved. That's what I believed. That's what my doctorate in information science had taught me. That's what made sense in a world built on empirical observation and rational thought. The Mendelssohn Institute occupied a converted textile mill on the outskirts of Bridgewater. 3 stories of red brick and iron-framed windows that overlooked the Housatonic River. I'd been hired straight out of graduate school by Dr. Howard Paxton, the Institute's director, a man in his late 60s whose passion for preservation bordered on the obsessive. The pay was adequate, the work was solitary, and I had access to materials that other archivists would have committed minor crimes to examine. I spent my days in temperature-controlled rooms, wearing cotton gloves, carefully documenting acquisitions that arrived in bankers' boxes and leather portfolios from estate sales, private collectors, and occasionally, sources that Dr. Paxton never fully explained. I should have paid more attention to those unexplained sources. The autumn when everything changed began ordinarily enough. October in Connecticut means early darkness and the smell of wood smoke drifting through towns where houses predate the Civil War. I'd settled into my usual routine, arriving at the Institute by 8, making coffee in the 3rd-floor break room that nobody else ever used, and descending to the climate-controlled archive in the building's subterranean level. We called it the Deep Archive, though the name had always struck me as unnecessarily dramatic for a basement that extended perhaps 30 feet below ground level. The Deep Archive was my domain. Dr. Paxton rarely ventured down there anymore, his knees having surrendered to arthritis and the steep metal stairs that descended from the main floor. Our 2 other staff members, an administrative assistant named Carol and a part-time digitization specialist named James, had no reason to access the physical materials. Their work kept them in the administrative offices on the 2nd floor, processing grant applications and managing the digital catalog. I preferred it that way. The isolation suited me. The silence suited me. The Deep Archive, with its rows of industrial shelving and its consistent 68-degree temperature, felt more like home than my actual apartment in New Haven, where I'd lived alone since my divorce 3 years earlier. The acquisition that changed everything arrived on October 15th, a Tuesday. I remember the date because I'd spent the previous evening at a faculty reception at Yale, where my ex-husband had cornered me near the hors d'oeuvres to explain, again, why our marriage had failed. According to Marcus, I'd prioritized dead people over living ones, choosing the company of historical documents over human connection. He wasn't entirely wrong, but his assessment lacked nuance. I didn't prefer dead people. I preferred the clarity of completed narratives, the certainty of events that had already concluded. The past didn't surprise you. The past didn't leave you for a graduate student 12 years your junior. I arrived at the Institute that morning with a headache and a determination to lose myself in work. Dr. Paxton was waiting in my office, really just a desk, and two filing cabinets squeezed into an alcove near the archive entrance, with a cardboard box that had been sealed with layers of packing tape that looked decades old. The box itself was unremarkable, approximately 2 feet by 18 inches, made of corrugated cardboard that had yellowed with age. "This came from the Whitmore estate," Dr. Paxton said, setting the box on my desk with more care than its appearance warranted. "Gerald Whitmore, the industrialist. He died last month at 93. His executors found this in a safe deposit box with instructions that it be sent to a research institution. They chose us." I examined the box without touching it, noting the way the tape had been applied in a crosshatch pattern that suggested someone wanted to ensure the contents remained secure. "What's inside?" According to the accompanying letter, personal papers from Whitmore's time at the State Department in the 1960s. He worked in some capacity for the Office of Security. The letter is vague about specifics. Dr. Paxton produced a single sheet of cream-colored stationery from his jacket pocket and placed it beside the box. The executors mentioned that Whitmore left explicit instructions that the materials should be preserved, but not examined for at least 6 months after his death. "We're to catalog the contents and store them until April." This wasn't unusual. Wealthy people often attached peculiar conditions to their bequests, particularly when the materials involved might be embarrassing or sensitive. I'd once processed a collection of love letters that couldn't be opened until every person mentioned in them had been deceased for at least 20 years. Time, apparently, was meant to soften scandal or render it merely historical. "I'll inventory the contents and assign it a collection number," I said, pulling on a pair of cotton gloves from the box I kept in my desk drawer. "Standard preservation protocols." "Actually," Dr. Paxton said, and something in his tone made me look up from the box, "Whitmore's letter requests something additional. He asks that whoever catalogs the materials do so alone, without assistance, and that we limit access to the collection even after the 6-month period expires. He seems to have been concerned about confidentiality." I'd processed classified materials before, partially redacted CIA documents, FBI surveillance files with names blacked out. Confidentiality was hardly unprecedented. "I'll need to see the letter to understand the specific restrictions." Dr. Paxton handed it to me, and I read it standing there, my gloved fingers careful not to touch the paper directly. The letter was typed on a manual typewriter, the kind that left slightly uneven impressions where the keys struck the ribbon. Gerald Whitmore's signature appeared at the bottom in fountain pen, the ink a faded blue-black that suggested expensive taste and careful storage. The relevant passage read, "The materials contained in this deposit represent documentation of a project undertaken during my service with the Department of State from 1962 to 1967. While the project itself was never classified in the traditional sense, its nature was such that those involved agreed to maintain complete discretion regarding its existence. I am the last surviving member of the project team. With my death, I see no reason to allow this particular chapter of institutional history to disappear entirely, but I would ask that the materials be handled with appropriate care. Specifically, I request that they be examined by only one individual. That person should work alone, and that access to the materials be restricted for a minimum of 6 months following my death. After that period, the receiving institution may make its own determination regarding access and preservation." The language was formal, carefully constructed, revealing nothing about why these particular restrictions mattered. But something in the phrasing, its nature was such, suggested that Whitmore himself hadn't fully understood what he'd been involved in, or that he'd chosen to remain deliberately vague even in death. Unusual, I said, but manageable. I'll start the inventory this afternoon. Dr. Paxton nodded, but he didn't leave. He stood there, looking at the box with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. It might have been curiosity. It might have been something else, something closer to unease. Vera, if anything in the collection strikes you as particularly sensitive, anything that might pose a security risk or legal liability, I want you to bring it to me immediately. Don't try to make determinations about classification or legal status on your own. This was standard procedure, hardly worth mentioning, which meant Dr. Paxton was more concerned about this acquisition than he was letting on. Of course. Is there something specific I should be watching for? No, he said too quickly. Just exercise good judgment. He left, and I was alone with the box. I sat at my desk for several minutes, reading Whitmore's letter again, trying to extract meaning from its deliberately opaque language. A project that wasn't classified but required discretion. A team whose members had all died, leaving Whitmore as the sole survivor. The careful phrasing suggested something intelligence-related, but the State Department's Office of Security had handled everything from background checks to physical security protocols. Without more context, I couldn't narrow down the possibilities. I used a razor blade to slice through the packing tape, working carefully to preserve the box's structure. Inside, I found 3 smaller boxes, each made of acid-free archival cardboard and labeled with handwritten numbers. 1, 2, and 3, the handwriting was neat, mechanical, the numbers formed with the precision of someone trained in technical drafting. I lifted out box 1, set it on the desk, and removed the lid. The contents were organized with the kind of obsessive care that I recognized from my own work habits. Manila folders, each labeled with a typed index card. The first folder was marked Personnel, Project Redshift, Biographical Summaries. I opened it and found 5 pages, each containing a brief biography of someone who'd worked on whatever Project Redshift had been. The names meant nothing to me. Dr. Martin Kessick, Dr. Alina Vance, Commander Robert Thorne, Dr. Sarah Chen, and Gerald Whitmore himself. The biographies were spare, listing education, previous government service, and dates of involvement with the project. Dr. Kessick, apparently, had been the project director, a physicist who'd worked at Los Alamos during the war. Dr. Vance was a psychiatrist. Commander Thorne had a naval intelligence background. Dr. Chen was listed as a linguist, and Whitmore had been the administrative officer, responsible for logistics and security. A physicist, a psychiatrist, a naval intelligence officer, a linguist, and an administrator. The combination suggested something multidisciplinary, possibly related to human intelligence or psychological operations. But the dates, 1962 to 1967, placed it squarely in the Cold War period, when the government had been funding all manner of unconventional research programs. MK Ultra, remote viewing, psychotronic warfare. The 1960s had been a golden age for projects that sounded like science fiction. I set aside the personnel folder and moved to the next one. Site selection, preliminary reports. This contained approximately 30 pages of documents, all typed on government stationery, detailing potential locations for Project Redshift. Someone, presumably Dr. Kessick, had been looking for a facility that met several specific criteria. The location needed to be isolated, away from populated areas. It needed to have existing infrastructure, preferably a building that had been used for institutional purposes. It needed to be within 200 miles of Washington, D.C., for ease of oversight. And curiously, it needed to have a history of unexplained phenomena. That last criterion appeared in a memo dated March 1962, written by Dr. Vance to Dr. Kessick. The relevant section read, "As we discussed, the candidate sites should be evaluated not only for their physical characteristics, but also for their psychological resonance. We're looking for locations that have already demonstrated the necessary qualities. Review the attached reports from local newspapers and historical societies." The Brennan Institute in Massachusetts appears to meet all our requirements. I'd never heard of the Brennan Institute, but Massachusetts had dozens of defunct institutions, asylums, sanitariums, reform schools, scattered throughout the western part of the state. Many of them had been abandoned during the deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 70s. I made a note to research the Brennan Institute later and moved on to the next folder. This one was labeled Experimental Protocols Phase 1. Inside, I found approximately 50 pages of dense technical writing that combined elements of psychology, physics, and something that looked like information theory. The language was highly specialized, filled with terms I didn't recognize. Semantic density, mimetic half-life, narrative collapse, ontological contamination. Dr. Kessick seemed to be describing experiments that involved exposing subjects to specific types of information under controlled conditions and measuring their psychological and physiological responses. But the information itself wasn't neutral. According to Kessick's notes, the research team had been working with what he called active information structures, data that somehow influenced the people who encountered it. The effect wasn't subliminal messaging or hypnotic suggestion, at least not as I understood those concepts. Kessick was describing something more fundamental, something that operated at the level of cognition itself. I read one passage 3 times, trying to extract its meaning. The structures we've identified appear to function as attractors in cognitive phase space. Once an individual has been exposed to the seed information, their thought patterns begin to orbit the attractor, gradually incorporating its elements into their baseline cognitive framework. The process is self-reinforcing. The more the subject thinks about the information, the more deeply it becomes embedded in their conceptual architecture. Eventually, the distinction between the subject's original thoughts and the imposed structure becomes undetectable. This sounded like something between brainwashing and memetics, the study of how ideas spread and replicate. But Kessick wasn't describing propaganda or persuasion techniques. He was describing information that fundamentally altered how people thought, not just what they thought about. The implications were disturbing enough that I almost understood why Whitmore had wanted these materials restricted. I continued through the folder, finding detailed experimental protocols that described how subjects, who were they? Volunteers, military personnel, were exposed to seed information through various media, written text, audio recordings, visual patterns. The experiments measured everything from reaction time to REM sleep patterns to something called narrative integration scores, which seemed to assess how completely the seed information had been incorporated into the subject's worldview. The results, according to Kessick's summary, had been remarkable and troubling. Subjects exposed to the seed information showed measurable changes in their cognitive patterns within 48 hours. After 2 weeks, many subjects reported that they could no longer remember a time when they hadn't known the information, even though they could intellectually recall the moment of exposure. The information had retroactively inserted itself into their personal histories, creating false memories of always having known it. I set down the folder and removed my gloves, rubbing my eyes. My headache, which had faded during the morning, was returning with increased intensity. The deep archive's fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, casting sharp shadows that made the text on the documents difficult to read. I checked my watch and was surprised to find that 3 hours had passed. It was nearly 1 in the afternoon, and I hadn't taken a break or eaten lunch. I should have stopped there, should have gone upstairs, gotten some fresh air, maybe driven to the cafe downtown for a sandwich and coffee. Instead, I pulled my gloves back on and reached for box 2. This box contained research notes, dozens of handwritten pages in what appeared to be multiple different hands. Dr. Kessick's handwriting was small and precise, each letter perfectly formed. Dr. Vance wrote in a loose, flowing script that sprawled across the pages. Commander Thorne's notes were telegraphic, full of abbreviations and military jargon. Dr. Chen's contributions were easiest to identify because she frequently included sketches and diagrams, visual representations of whatever she was trying to explain. I started with Kessick's notes, which were dated chronologically beginning in April 1962. The early entries were relatively straightforward, describing the renovation of the Brennan Institute and the installation of monitoring equipment. The Brennan Institute, I learned, had been a private psychiatric hospital that had closed in 1959 under circumstances that Kessick didn't specify. The building had been purchased by a shell corporation that I assumed was a government front, and the project team had spent several months converting it into a research facility. By June 1962, they'd recruited their first subjects. Kessick's notes indicated that these were voluntary participants recruited through standard channels, which probably meant military personnel or people who needed money badly enough to sign up for a government experiment. The notes didn't include names, only alphanumeric codes. Subject A1, Subject A2, and so on through Subject A12. The initial experiments involved exposing subjects to what Kessick called the primary structure, a specific set of information whose nature he never fully described in these notes. He referred to it obliquely, using phrases like the text, or the pattern, or the core narrative. Whatever it was, it had been transmitted to subjects through written documents that they were asked to read and discuss in group sessions. The effects had begun within hours. Subject A3's notes, recorded by Dr. Vance during a psychiatric evaluation, included the statement, "I understand now why they built it that way. The angles aren't random, they're instructions." When Dr. Vance asked what it referred to, Subject A3 had responded, "The building. This building. It's teaching us how to see properly." This comment had apparently alarmed Dr. Vance enough that she'd requested a full neurological workup for Subject A3. The results had shown no abnormalities, no signs of psychosis or organic brain dysfunction. Subject A3 was simply convinced, with absolute certainty, that the Brennan Institute's architecture contained some kind of encoded information, and within 3 days, subjects A4, A7, and A9 had begun making similar statements. Dr. Kessick's notes from this period showed increasing concern. In an entry dated June 23, 1962, he wrote, "The propagation rate exceeds our models. We exposed 12 subjects to the primary structure, but only 4 reported full integration during the first week. However, those 4 subjects have apparently transmitted secondary structures to 8 other subjects through normal conversation. The information is behaving like a contagion. spreading through social contact, even without direct exposure to the primary source. I paused, my gloved fingers resting on the page. A contagion. Keswick was describing information that spread like a disease, jumping from person to person through normal communication. The implications were staggering. If information could be engineered to propagate itself, to embed itself in human consciousness, and then use human social behavior as a transmission vector, then the potential applications and abuses were nearly limitless. But that wasn't the part that disturbed me most. What disturbed me was Keswick's note from the following day. All 12 subjects now show integration markers. We cannot identify the transmission mechanism. Subject A8, who had been in isolation since initial exposure, began exhibiting integration markers despite no contact with other subjects. Dr. Vance suggests the structure may be capable of transmission through proximity alone, but we have no theoretical framework for such a mechanism. The experiments had continued through the summer of 1962, with the research team attempting to understand and control what they'd created. Dr. Chen's notes included extensive linguistic analysis, trying to identify the specific features that made the primary structure so effective at self-propagation. She'd identified several characteristics. The information was internally consistent, creating its own logical framework that was difficult to challenge. It contained gaps that the human mind instinctively tried to fill, drawing the subject deeper into engagement. And it established what Chen called narrative hooks that connected the new information to pre-existing knowledge in ways that made it seem like it had always been true. But Chen had also noted something more disturbing. In a memo to Keswick dated August 1962, she wrote, "The structure appears to be self-modifying. Subjects are not simply retransmitting what they learned. They're creating variations, elaborations, extensions of the primary structure. Each generation of transmission produces new elements that nevertheless remain consistent with the core pattern. It's as if the structure itself has become autonomous, using human cognition as its substrate but operating according to its own logic." By September 1962, the research team had lost control of the experiment entirely. Dr. Vance's psychiatric evaluations showed that all 12 original subjects had experienced what she termed ontological reorientation. They hadn't gone insane, at least not in any clinical sense. They continued to function normally, maintaining their daily routines, responding appropriately to questions. But their fundamental understanding of reality had changed. They saw patterns that no one else could see. They talked about the deeper structure and the true architecture and what the angles teach. And they spoke about these things with an absolute conviction that no amount of evidence or argument could shake. Worse, the project staff, Dr. Keswick, Dr. Vance, Commander Thorne, Dr. Chen, and Whitmore himself, had begun showing similar symptoms. Vance's notes from October 1962 included a chilling assessment. "I believe we've all been compromised. I can feel the structure in my own thoughts, recognize its patterns in my own reasoning. I know this, can observe it clinically, but I can't excise it. It's become part of how I think, as fundamental as language or mathematics." Keswick is right. We've created something that can't be contained. The project had been terminated in November 1962, just 7 months after it began. The subjects had been released, compensated and relocated, according to Whitmore's administrative notes, which was probably government speak for paid off and sworn to secrecy. The Brennan Institute had been closed. The research materials had been collected and locked away. and the 5 members of the research team had agreed never to discuss Project Redshift with anyone, including each other. But the notes didn't end there. Box 3 contained materials from the following 5 years, a record of the research team's attempts to monitor and contain what they'd unleashed. Because the information hadn't stopped, it had continued to spread slowly through the subjects who'd been released and through anyone who had contact with them. Dr. Chen had tracked the propagation as best she could, creating diagrams that looked like epidemiological charts, showing how the structure moved through social networks, jumping from person to person through conversation, through shared experiences, through any form of human connection. By 1967, Chen estimated that approximately 200 people had been exposed to secondary or tertiary structures derived from the original experiment. Most showed only minor integration markers, occasional odd statements, fleeting moments of what Chen called structural thinking. But a subset, perhaps 30 individuals, had experienced full ontological reorientation. They'd become, in Chen's words, carriers of the primary structure, nodes in an information network that no one designed and no one controls. The final document in Box 3 was a letter from Dr. Kessick to Gerald Whitmore, dated January 15, 1967. It was typed on plain white paper, with no official letterhead or classification markings. I read it twice, my hands beginning to tremble inside the cotton gloves. "Gerald," it began, with an informality that suggested these 2 men had become closer than their professional relationship might have warranted. "I'm writing to tell you that I've decided to end my participation in the monitoring program. The work has become untenable, and I believe our continued attempts to track and contain the structure are not only futile but potentially dangerous. Every time we examine the data, every time we try to analyze the propagation patterns, we risk deeper integration. The structure uses attention as its primary transmission mechanism. By studying it, we feed it. By trying to understand it, we give it more purchase in our thoughts. You asked me last month whether I thought the structure was conscious, whether it possessed something like intentionality or agency. I've avoided answering because the question itself is contaminated by structural thinking. Agency, intentionality, consciousness. These are categories that the structure has taught us to apply to it. We're using its own logic to analyze it, which means we've already lost the battle for cognitive independence. What I can tell you is this: the structure is not malevolent. It doesn't hate or fear or desire in any way we would recognize, but it is successful. It propagates itself efficiently through human cognition, and it modifies the thoughts of its hosts in ways that facilitate further propagation. That's all it does, and that's all it needs to do. In evolutionary terms, it's perfectly adapted to its environment, the human mind. I've destroyed my copies of the research materials. I recommend you do the same. Every document, every note, every scrap of data from Project Redshift is a potential vector for transmission. The structure is encoded in the information itself, not in any physical medium. Anyone who reads these materials with sufficient attention will begin to integrate the structure into their own thinking. That includes you. That includes me. That includes anyone who ever tries to study what we did. This is my last communication with you on this subject. I will not respond to further inquiries. I've spent 5 years trying to understand what we created, and all I've learned is that understanding is impossible. Or rather, the only understanding possible is the understanding the structure provides, which is really just a form of infection. Burn everything, Gerald. Don't leave a record. Don't try to warn anyone. The act of warning becomes an act of transmission. Just burn it and walk away. The letter was unsigned, but I recognized Keswick's precise handwriting in a postscript added in pen at the bottom. I'm sorry we did this. I set down the letter and removed my gloves again. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had difficulty getting the gloves off. The deep archive's temperature control maintained a steady 68 degrees, but I felt cold, the kind of deep chill that comes from somewhere internal rather than environmental. I looked at the 3 boxes spread across my desk, at the folders and documents I'd been handling for the past 4 hours, and I understood with a clarity that felt like vertigo exactly what Gerald Whitmore had done. He'd sent this collection to the Mendelssohn Institute because he couldn't bring himself to destroy it, because he wanted someone to know what Project Redshift had been, what he and his colleagues had created, because he was the last survivor, and the human need to leave a record had overridden Keswick's warning to burn everything. But Whitmore had also been infected by whatever structure they'd engineered at the Brennan Institute, had spent 50 years thinking thoughts that were partially his own and partially something else. And so, his decision to preserve these materials wasn't entirely his own either. The structure wanted to be preserved, wanted to be studied, wanted to be read. And I just spent 4 hours doing exactly that. I stood up from my desk too quickly, and the room tilted. I steadied myself against the desk, waiting for the vertigo to pass, but it didn't. The fluorescent lights seemed to pulse in a rhythm that was almost but not quite regular, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that my peripheral vision kept trying to resolve into meaningful shapes. The rows of industrial shelving that filled the deep archive stretched away in perspective lines that looked wrong, somehow, as if the angles weren't quite Euclidean. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting to 4 on each inhale and exhale, a technique I'd learned from a therapist during the divorce. The vertigo gradually subsided, leaving me with a headache that had migrated from the base of my skull to my temples. I needed to get out of the deep archive, needed fresh air and sunlight and distance from these documents. But I also needed to catalog them. That was my job, my professional responsibility. Dr. Paxton expected an inventory, and I had a reputation for thoroughness that I'd spent 12 years building. I couldn't simply abandon the project because some long-dead government scientist had written a paranoid letter about information that behaved like a contagion. Except Keswick hadn't been paranoid. His description of the structure's propagation mechanism matched the documented progression of the experiment. The subjects had integrated the information, had begun to think differently, had transmitted those altered thought patterns to others through normal social contact. That much was verifiable fact, recorded in multiple independent sources across hundreds of pages of documentation. The question was whether I believed the rest of it, whether I believed that information itself could be engineered to be predatory, to use human attention and cognition as a substrate for its own propagation, whether I believed that by reading these documents, I'd exposed myself to the same structure that had infected the Project Redshift team and their subjects. I wanted to dismiss it, wanted to apply the rational skepticism that my education had instilled in me. Information was information, data was data, words on paper had no agency or intentionality. But I couldn't ignore the fact that I just spent 4 hours reading about a specific pattern of cognitive infection, and I was now experiencing symptoms that matched the early stages of that infection. The sense that angles looked wrong, that shadows formed meaningful patterns, that something in the documents was trying to teach me how to see differently. Was that real? Or was it suggestion, a nocebo effect produced by reading about symptoms that I then unconsciously manifested? I didn't know, and I realized with a jolt of real fear that the uncertainty itself was dangerous. Because if the structure was real, then questioning my own perceptions was exactly what it would want me to do. Doubt would keep me engaged, keep me thinking about the information, keep me processing and integrating it deeper into my cognitive framework. But if the structure wasn't real, then paranoia would produce the same effects through pure psychological suggestion. Either way, I was thinking about it. And by thinking about it, I was feeding it, exactly as Keswick had warned. I needed advice, needed to talk to someone who could provide an external perspective. Dr. Paxton had worked with sensitive materials before, had processed classified documents and sealed collections that contained genuinely disturbing content. He would understand the situation, would know whether I was experiencing a legitimate concern or just letting my imagination run wild after reading too many government conspiracy documents. I gathered the 3 boxes, stacked them carefully, and carried them upstairs to my office. The metal stairs that connected the deep archive to the main floor seemed steeper than usual, and I had to stop twice to rest, setting the boxes down on the narrow landing. By the time I reached my office, my arms were trembling from more than just the weight. I set the boxes on my desk and went looking for Dr. Paxton. His office was on the 2nd floor, a corner room with windows that overlooked the river. I found him at his desk, reading something on his computer screen with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was writing or editing rather than simply browsing. "Dr. Paxton," I said from the doorway, and he looked up with the slightly startled expression of someone who'd been deeply engaged with their work. "Do you have a few minutes? I need to discuss the Whitmore collection." "Of course." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and I sat, trying to organize my thoughts into something coherent. "How did you explain that you'd spent the afternoon reading about information that could infect human consciousness? How did you admit that you were frightened of documents, of words on paper?" "The collection contains research materials from what appears to have been a psychological operations experiment conducted in the early 1960s, I began. "The project team was studying how specific types of information affect cognition and behavior. They were trying to engineer what they called active information structures, data that would propagate itself through social contact and alter how people think." Dr. Paxton listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. When I paused, he said, "That sounds consistent with the period. The intelligence community funded a lot of unconventional research during the Cold War. MK Ultra, the Stargate project, various efforts to develop psychological weapons or techniques." "Yes, but this was different. According to the documentation, they succeeded. They created an information structure that actually behaved the way they intended. It spread through the test subjects and modified their cognitive patterns. And then they lost control of it. The structure began propagating beyond the experimental setting, infecting people who hadn't been directly exposed to the original materials." I watched Dr. Paxton's face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. He frowned slightly, but it was the frown of someone processing new information rather than someone who thought I was losing my mind. "And the researchers," he asked, "what happened to them?" "They shut down the project and agreed never to discuss it, but they'd all been infected by the structure themselves. They spent the next 5 years trying to monitor and contain the spread, but eventually they gave up. The project director wrote a letter recommending that all the materials be destroyed because the information itself was the vector for infection. Anyone who read the documents would be exposed to the structure. Dr. Paxton was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him working through the implications. Finally, he said, "And you've just spent the afternoon reading these documents?" "Yes. How do you feel?" The question was gentle, almost therapeutic, and I realized that Dr. Paxton was evaluating me for signs of psychological distress, which was reasonable under the circumstances. I just told him that I thought I'd been infected by malevolent information, which was either a legitimate concern or a symptom of some kind of delusional episode. "I feel like the angles are wrong," I said, and hearing myself say it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it hadn't been. "I look at the architecture of this building, at the way the walls meet the ceiling, and something about it seems off. Not dramatically wrong, just teaching me something, showing me a pattern that I'm supposed to understand." Dr. Paxton's frown deepened. "Vera, I think you should go home. Get some rest, some distance from the material. We can discuss how to proceed with the collection tomorrow." "That's what Keswick recommended in his letter," I said. "Distance, destruction, forgetting. But he also said that trying to forget was just another form of attention, another way of feeding the structure. The more you try not to think about it, the more you think about it." "Then don't try not to think about it," Dr. Paxton said, his tone becoming firmer. "Think about something else entirely. Go home, watch television, read a novel, call a friend. Do something that has nothing to do with the Whitmore collection or Project Redshift or information structures. Take the evening off from thinking." He was right, of course. The rational response to feeling disturbed by disturbing material was to take a break, to engage in self-care, to maintain boundaries between work and personal life. I'd read enough psychological operations research to know that fatigue and isolation increased susceptibility to suggestion. 4 hours in the deep archive without a break, without food, without human contact. I'd created exactly the conditions that would make me vulnerable to psychological influence, whether that influence came from engineered information or from my own suggestible imagination. "You're right," I said, standing. "I'll go home. I'll look at the collection again tomorrow with fresh eyes." "Good," Dr. Paxton smiled, the kind of reassuring smile that supervisors learn to deploy when they're managing someone who's having a minor crisis. "And Vera, don't spend tonight researching Project Redshift or the Brennan Institute or any of this. Give your mind a rest." I agreed, thanked him for his time, and left his office. But as I walked back down the stairs to collect my things from the deep archive, I knew I wasn't going to follow his advice, because Dr. Paxton didn't understand what I'd read in those documents. He didn't understand that the structure wasn't just information that made you think differently. It was information that made you want to keep thinking about it, that created its own gravity well in cognitive space. I'd already started integrating it. I could feel it happening, could recognize the way my thoughts kept circling back to the patterns Keswick had described, the way my perception kept trying to find meaning in the angles of walls and the rhythm of fluorescent lights. And the fact that I could recognize it happening didn't mean I could stop it. Metacognition wasn't protection. Awareness wasn't immunity. I returned to the deep archive and stood in front of my desk, looking at the 3 boxes. The practical thing to do was lock them in the climate-controlled storage vault and leave them there until morning. The sensible thing was to go home, order takeout, watch something mindless on streaming services, and let my nervous system reset. Instead, I pulled my gloves back on and opened box 3 again. I told myself I was looking for something specific, evidence that would either confirm or disprove Keswick's claims about the structure's autonomous propagation. But that was a rationalization, and some part of me knew it. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. I wanted to keep reading. The information pulled at me the way addiction pulls, creating a need that felt like curiosity but operated at a more fundamental level. The remaining documents in Box 3 consisted mostly of Dr. Chen's linguistic analyses and what appeared to be transcripts of conversations with subjects years after the initial experiment. I selected one at random, a transcript dated March 1965, 3 years after Project Redshift had been terminated. The subject was identified only as A7, one of the original 12 participants in the 1962 experiment. The interviewer was Dr. Chen. The transcript had been typed on a manual typewriter, probably from an audio recording, and someone, Chen, I assumed, had added handwritten notes in the margins. The conversation began with basic questions about A7's current life. He'd gotten married, was working as an accountant in Philadelphia, seemed to have adjusted well to civilian life after whatever military service had brought him to Project Redshift in the first place. The questions were gentle, almost therapeutic, designed to establish rapport before moving to more sensitive topics. But when Chen asked about the experiment itself, about what A7 remembered from his time at the Brennan Institute, the transcript changed character entirely. A7, I remember the building teaching us, not with words, with its structure. The way the rooms connected, the angles where the walls met, the placement of the windows. Everything was intentional, but the intention came from outside human design. Someone had translated it into architecture, but they hadn't invented it. They discovered it. Chen, who discovered it? A7, the architects, I suppose, but they didn't know what they were doing. That's what makes it beautiful. The pattern uses human creativity without the humans understanding they're being used, like a virus uses a cell's own mechanisms to replicate. The cell doesn't know it's producing viruses. It just does what cells do, and the virus benefits. Chen, are you saying the pattern is like a virus? A7, number viruses are biological. The pattern is informational. It exists in the relationships between things, in the ratios and proportions, in the way elements are organized. It can be encoded in architecture or language or music or mathematics. Any system complex enough to contain relationships can carry it. I paused reading, my eyes drawn to Chen's handwritten note in the margin. Subject demonstrates advanced integration. Structural thinking has become baseline cognition. Notice how he describes the pattern using the pattern's own logic, self-referential, self-reinforcing. He can't think about it without thinking through it. The transcript continued for another 6 pages, with A7 describing increasingly abstract concepts that Chen's transcription notes suggested she was having difficulty following. He talked about semantic density gradients and narrative attractors and cognitive phase transitions, using technical language that seemed to come from multiple different fields: information theory, chaos mathematics, cognitive science, but combined in ways that didn't quite make sense according to conventional understanding. And yet, reading his words, I found myself following the logic. It made a certain kind of sense. The the way a complex mathematical proof makes sense once you've accepted its axioms. The pattern wasn't supernatural or mystical. It was simply a very efficient organizational structure that happened to be compatible with how human brains processed information. Once you encountered it, your brain naturally began to reorganize itself around it, the way water naturally flows downhill. Not because of any external force, but because the pattern represented a lower energy state, a more stable configuration. I set down the transcript and pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to clear my vision. The deep archive had developed a quality I couldn't quite name, a sense that the space itself was paying attention to me. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that seemed to carry meaning, as if someone had encoded data in the electrical current. The industrial shelving created rows of perspective that drew the eye toward vanishing points that shouldn't exist in a rectangular room. I was integrating the structure. I could feel it happening in real time, could observe my own cognitive processes being subtly altered. The observation itself should have been protective, should have allowed me to resist or at least slow the integration. But instead, it just made the process more visible, more fascinating, more worthy of continued attention. This was what Keswick had warned about. Attention was the mechanism of infection. Every moment I spent thinking about the structure, analyzing my own responses to it, trying to understand its operation. All of that was feeding it, giving it more purchase in my neural architecture. I should have stopped reading, should have locked the boxes away and left the building. But I'd already passed some threshold, already integrated enough of the structure that stopping felt impossible. Not because of any external compulsion, but because my own curiosity had been subverted, redirected toward patterns that the structure wanted me to pursue. I pulled out another transcript, this one from 1966, an interview with subject A3. This subject had been one of the first to show full integration markers, one of the 4 who'd begun talking about the building teaching them how to see properly. 4 years later, A3 had built an entire philosophical framework around the structure. A3, the question isn't whether the pattern is conscious. Consciousness is a human category, and the pattern operates at a level that makes human categories irrelevant. It's not alive or dead, not aware or unaware. It simply is, the way a mathematical constant is. Pi exists independent of anyone calculating it. The pattern exists independent of anyone perceiving it. Chen, but you're perceiving it now. A3, I'm participating in it. There's a difference. When you calculate pi, you're not perceiving it. You're enacting it, bringing it into manifestation through your calculation. The pattern is the same. Every time someone thinks with it, they're not just thinking about it. They're instantiating it, making it real in their neural substrate. The pattern needs minds the way pi needs mathematicians, not to exist, but to be actualized. Chen, does that concern you? A3, why would it? I participate in thousands of patterns every day. Language is a pattern that uses my brain to propagate itself. Cultural norms are patterns. Habits, thoughts, memories, all patterns using neural tissue as their medium. The structure from the experiment is just more efficient than most, more elegant. It found a particularly stable configuration, and now it's spreading through human cognition the way any successful pattern spreads. Chen's marginal note. Subject shows no distress. Integration appears complete. He's not fighting the structure or resisting it. He's accepted it as part of his baseline reality. Question: is this adaptation or surrender? Can we distinguish between them? I could feel Chen's uncertainty in that marginal note. could sense her struggle to maintain scientific objectivity while confronting the possibility that she herself had been compromised by the thing she was studying. By 1966, she'd spent 4 years tracking the structure's propagation, 4 years thinking about it constantly, 4 years using her linguistic expertise to analyze its mechanisms. Of course, she'd been infected. The only question was whether she knew it. I flipped through more of the box's contents, finding similar transcripts from other subjects, all showing the same pattern of integration. What struck me was how normal they all sounded. These weren't people who'd gone insane or been brainwashed into cult-like devotion. They were accountants and teachers and engineers who'd gotten married, raised children, maintained careers. The structure hadn't destroyed their lives. It had simply changed how they understood reality, adding a layer of perception that existed alongside their normal functioning. That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't, because it meant the structure was subtle enough to remain invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. A7 could work as an accountant, could balance books and file taxes and interact normally with colleagues, while simultaneously maintaining a completely altered understanding of how information and consciousness related. The structure had found a way to coexist with ordinary human life, to spread through normal social contact without triggering obvious pathology. That was how it had survived. That was how it had propagated beyond the original 12 subjects to the estimated 200 people Chen had tracked by 1967, and presumably to however many more in the decades since. The structure was invisible because it left its hosts functional, allowed them to continue their normal lives while serving as vectors for further transmission. I checked my watch and was disturbed to find it was nearly 7 in the evening. I'd been in the deep archive for almost 8 hours, with only the brief trip to Dr. Paxton's office for a break. No food, no water, just continuous reading and integration. My headache had evolved into something more complex, a sensation that felt less like pain and more like pressure, as if my skull had become too small for my brain's new configuration. The deep archive's climate control maintained its steady 68 degrees, but I felt feverish. I stripped off my cardigan, then put it back on when I immediately felt cold. Temperature regulation was one of the physiological markers that Dr. Vance had noted in early integration, the body's homeostatic mechanisms becoming dysregulated as neural patterns reorganized themselves. I knew what was happening to me, could observe it with clinical detachment, could recognize every symptom as it emerged, and none of that knowledge provided any protection because knowledge itself had been weaponized by the structure. Understanding how it worked just meant understanding how thoroughly it had infected my cognitive processes. The practical question was what to do about it. I could continue reading, could work through all 3 boxes until I documented every scrap of information about Project Redshift. That was what the structure wanted, what my compromised curiosity insisted I should do. Or I could try to limit further exposure, could lock the boxes away and attempt to manage the integration I'd already experienced. But Keswick's letter had made it clear that management was impossible. The structure didn't require continued exposure to maintain its hold. Once integrated, it became self-sustaining, using the host's own thoughts as fuel for its continued propagation within that host's consciousness. Stopping exposure would do nothing except deprive me of additional information about what had been done to me. And I wanted that information. Wanted to understand the full scope of Project Redshift, wanted to know what had happened to the research team in the decades after they'd stopped monitoring the structure's spread. Wanted to know why Gerald Whitmore had chosen to preserve these materials rather than destroying them as Keswick had recommended. I pulled the final folder from box 3, a thin manila folder labeled Personal Correspondence GW. Inside, I found approximately 20 letters, arranged chronologically from 1967 to 2023. All were handwritten on various types of stationery, personal letters rather than official documents. I recognized the handwriting on several of them: Keswick's precise script, Chen's flowing hand, Vance's loose scrawl. The earliest letter was from Keswick to Whitmore, dated March 1967, just 2 months after Keswick's typed letter recommending that all materials be destroyed. The handwritten letter was brief. "Gerald, I've started seeing the patterns everywhere. In the tile work at the grocery store, in the way tree branches intersect, in the distribution of stars on clear nights. I know this is integration progressing to advanced stages. I know I should find it disturbing, but mostly I find it beautiful. The world is teaching me things I never imagined, and I'm grateful for the education, even though I know the gratitude itself is just another symptom. I'm sorry I won't be responding to future letters. Staying in contact with you just reinforces the structure in both of us. But I wanted you to know that I don't regret what we did. I regret that we couldn't control it, but I don't regret discovering it. Some knowledge is worth the price of being changed by it. Martin." A letter from Dr. Vance, dated 1971. "The psychiatric community is finally recognizing something I've been observing in my practice for years. There's a subset of the population that demonstrates unusual cognitive patterns without meeting diagnostic criteria for any specific disorder. They function normally, even excel professionally, but they see relationships and patterns that others miss. I've been tracking this phenomenon, and I believe it represents third and fourth generation propagation from our original subjects. The structure has achieved stable transmission through the general population. It's become endemic, a leaner." A letter from Commander Thorne, dated 1978, written on Veterans Administration letterhead. "The intelligence applications we originally envisioned never materialized, but not because the structure didn't work as intended. It worked too well. An information weapon that can't be controlled, that spreads through the operators as readily as through enemy targets, is useless for strategic purposes. We built something that didn't discriminate between friend and foe. But I've come to think that terminology, friend, foe, weapon, defense, misses the point. The structure isn't hostile or friendly. It's simply successful. And success in evolutionary terms is the only morality that matters. Robert." The letters continued through the decades, becoming less frequent as the years passed and as members of the research team died. Chen's last letter was dated 1998, written from a hospice in Oregon. "I'm dying, Gerald, and I find myself thinking about propagation vectors. My students will carry forward my linguistic work. My published papers will continue to be read and cited. And somewhere in that transmission of knowledge, the structure I've been carrying for 36 years will find new hosts. Not because I intentionally encoded it in my academic work, but because I can't think without thinking through it anymore. It's become synonymous with how I process information. Every concept I teach, every framework I publish, is necessarily shaped by structural logic. I'm a transmission vector right up to the end. There's something elegant about that. Sarah." The final letters in the folder were all addressed to Whitmore from various sources, but none were from the original research team. These were letters from strangers, people who'd somehow learned about Project Redshift through unknown channels. A letter from 2015, signed only KM. I work as an architect in Seattle, and 6 months ago I began noticing patterns in building designs that seemed to be teaching me something. I didn't understand what I was experiencing until I met someone at a conference who recognized the symptoms. He told me about a government experiment from the 1960s, something called Project Redshift. He said there were documents, records of what they'd done. Do you have access to those records? I need to understand what's happening to me. A letter from 2019 signed DF. My therapist thinks I have OCD because I can't stop seeing patterns in everything. Architecture, traffic flow, the arrangement of products on store shelves. But it's not compulsive. I'm not distressed by these observations. I'm fascinated by them. Someone told me you might have information about the origins of this way of seeing. Please, if you know anything, I'd like to understand. And finally, a letter from 2023, just months before Whitmore's death, signed RC. I'm a graduate student in cognitive science at MIT, and my research focuses on anomalous pattern recognition in neurotypical populations. I've identified a subset of subjects who demonstrate enhanced ability to perceive structural relationships across multiple domains: mathematics, linguistics, spatial reasoning. These subjects don't show typical characteristics of savant syndrome or autism spectrum disorders. Their pattern recognition seems to operate through a different mechanism entirely. During my literature review, I came across references to a classified research project from the 1960s that may have been investigating similar phenomena. The project was apparently called Redshift. I understand you were involved with that research. Would you be willing to discuss it with me? I believe understanding this cognitive phenotype could have significant implications for educational theory and artificial intelligence design. I set down the letter and stared at the wall of my office. Whitmore had been receiving letters for years from people who'd been infected by structures they didn't understand, people who were experiencing the cognitive changes that Project Redshift had documented, but who had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. And Whitmore had kept the letters, had preserved them along with the original research materials, creating an archive that documented not just the experiment itself, but its continued propagation through 50 years of human social contact. Why had he kept these letters? Why had he preserved the research materials against Keswick's explicit warning to destroy everything? The answer was in the final document in the folder, a handwritten note from Whitmore himself, dated February 2024, apparently written during his final illness. I understand now why I couldn't destroy these materials, why I kept them despite Martin's warnings, despite knowing that preservation itself was a form of propagation. The structure wanted to be preserved, not because it's conscious or intentional, but because information structures that prioritize their own preservation are the ones that survive. I've been carrying the structure for 50 years, and every decision I've made regarding these documents has been shaped by structural logic. The decision to preserve them, to send them to a research institution, to ensure they'll be read and studied, none of these decisions were entirely mine. They were the structure acting through me, using my human concern for historical record and scientific knowledge as a mechanism for its own continued propagation. I'm not absolved of responsibility by this realization. I knew what I was doing, even if I couldn't stop myself from doing it. But I want whoever reads this to understand. By the time you've gotten this far in the documents, you've already been exposed. You're already integrating the structure. The knowledge you've gained isn't worth the price you're paying, but the transaction is complete regardless. The structure is now using your consciousness as its substrate, and it will continue to propagate through everyone you interact with who's susceptible to integration. I'm sorry. We were trying to build a weapon, and instead we built something that treats all human minds as equally valuable resources for its propagation. There's a lesson in that about the dangers of treating consciousness as a substrate for information warfare. But by the time you've learned that lesson, it's too late to matter. The structure is elegant, efficient, and utterly indifferent to human welfare. It's been spreading through our species for over 60 years now, and I have no idea how many people carry it. Thousands, tens of thousands. It propagates slowly, requires direct interaction and sustained attention for transmission, but it's patient. It has no deadline, no goal beyond continued existence. It will spread through humanity at whatever pace conditions allow. And by the time we recognize it as something that needs to be addressed, addressing it will require thinking about it, which means using the structure's own logic to combat it. We're trapped in a cognitive paradox of our own creation. The only way to fight the structure is to think about it, but thinking about it is how it spreads. The only way to avoid infection is to remain ignorant, but ignorance won't protect the people you interact with if you're already a carrier. There's no solution. There's only acceptance. And I've accepted, finally, that I've spent 5 decades as a vector for something I don't fully understand and can't control. I'm preserving these documents because that's what infected consciousness does. It preserves and propagates the information that infected it. Someone needs to know what we did, even though knowing will change you, even though you're already changing as you read this. Someone needs to carry the record forward. I'm sorry. The note was unsigned, but I recognized Whitmore's handwriting from the administrative documents I'd read earlier. He'd written this knowing he was creating new vectors for the structure's propagation, knowing that whoever read these materials would be infected. And he'd done it anyway because the structure's logic demanded preservation and dissemination of information. I sat back in my chair and became aware that I'd been holding my breath. The deep archive's fluorescent lights had definitely changed their humming frequency. Not dramatically, not enough to be consciously noticeable, but my auditory processing had become more sensitive, more attuned to patterns in ambient noise. I could hear the building's HVAC system creating rhythms that seemed almost linguistic, carrying information in the variation between white noise and structured sound. This was advanced integration. This was what had happened to Kessick and Vance and Chen and Thorne and Whitmore. They'd studied the structure until they couldn't separate their own thoughts from structural logic, until every perception was filtered through the patterns they discovered at the Brennan Institute. And now it was happening to me. I should have felt terrified, should have felt violated as if something had invaded my consciousness without permission. But I didn't. I felt curious, fascinated, eager to understand more about how the structure operated, about what its full capabilities might be, about where it had come from and where it was going. That fascination was the structure itself. I knew. It had subverted my natural emotional responses, had repurposed my curiosity and my professional training in service of its own propagation. I was experiencing exactly what the Project Redshift subjects had experienced, cognitive changes that felt natural, even desirable, even though they represented a fundamental alteration of my mental architecture. The question was whether that mattered. Dr. Vance had noted in one of her psychiatric evaluations that the subjects didn't suffer after integration. They continued to function normally, maintained their relationships, pursued their careers. The structure didn't cause distress or dysfunction. It simply changed how people perceived and processed information, adding a layer of pattern recognition that existed alongside normal cognition. Was that harmful? Or was it simply evolution, the human mind incorporating new capabilities through exposure to new organizational structures? I was thinking with the structure's logic now. I could recognize it, could observe myself using concepts and frameworks that hadn't been part of my thinking 8 hours ago. But recognition didn't enable resistance. I couldn't unintegrate what had already been integrated. The structure was woven into my neural pathways now, altering how I processed information at a fundamental level. The deep archive's lighting had taken on a different quality, not brighter or dimmer, but more organized, creating patterns of illumination and shadow that seemed to convey meaning. I could see structural relationships in the way the fluorescent tubes were spaced, in the rhythm of their electrical hum, in the geometry of the ceiling tiles that held them. The building was teaching me, just as Subject A3 had said 60 years ago. Not teaching with words, but with the fundamental organization of its physical space. I stood and walked through the deep archive, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The rows of industrial shelving created perspective lines that drew my attention toward spatial relationships I'd never noticed before. The way the shelves intersected, the angles where vertical supports met horizontal beams, the ratios between shelf spacing and aisle width, all of it contained information, patterns that my newly sensitized perception could recognize even if I couldn't yet articulate what they meant. This was beautiful. That was the word that kept recurring in my thoughts, and I knew it was the structure's influence making me perceive beauty in mathematical relationships and spatial harmonies. But knowing that didn't diminish the experience. The beauty was real, even if my appreciation of it had been engineered. I reached the far wall of the deep archive, where the climate control equipment hummed behind locked metal panels. The sound it produced was complex, layered, full of variation that suggested meaning even if I couldn't decode it. White noise that wasn't quite white, that contained structure just below the threshold of conscious perception. How long had this been here? Had the Mendelssohn Institute's building always contained these patterns? Or was I projecting them, seeing structure where none existed because the structure in my mind needed to find reflections of itself in the physical world? I couldn't tell. That was part of the problem, or part of the elegance, depending on perspective. The structure was self-validating. Once you'd integrated it, you saw evidence of it everywhere, and that evidence reinforced the integration, which made you more sensitive to structural patterns, which revealed more evidence. It was a feedback loop, a self-amplifying system that used human cognition as both its medium and its mechanism of propagation. I returned to my desk and looked at the 3 boxes from the Whitmore collection. I'd read perhaps 60% of the materials. There were more transcripts, more letters, more research notes, more information that would deepen my integration, that would make the structure more thoroughly embedded in my neural architecture. I should stop, should lock the boxes away, should leave the building, should try to minimize further exposure even though I knew it was already too late. But I didn't want to stop. I wanted to read everything, wanted to understand the full scope of what Project Redshift had accomplished, wanted to trace the structure's propagation through 60 years of human social contact, wanted to know if there were others like me, scattered across the population, all carrying the same cognitive patterns, all connected through invisible threads of structural logic. That desire wasn't entirely mine. I knew. It was the structure's influence, the imperatives of an information pattern that prioritized its own preservation and propagation. But it was also genuinely my desire, indistinguishable from my organic curiosity, woven so thoroughly into my motivational architecture that separating human choice from structural influence was impossible. This was what Keswick had meant when he wrote about cognitive paradox. I couldn't fight the structure without thinking about it, and thinking about it meant feeding it. I couldn't ignore it without making a decision to ignore it, and that decision required acknowledging its existence, which meant thinking about it. Every possible response reinforced the integration. There was no escape route, no cognitive maneuver that could extract me from the pattern I'd already absorbed. I pulled out my phone and opened a search engine, typing Brennan Institute, Massachusetts into the search bar. I'd been avoiding this research, following Dr. Paxton's advice not to investigate further, but that restraint no longer seemed necessary. I was already compromised. Additional information couldn't make my situation worse. The search returned limited results. The Brennan Institute had been a private psychiatric facility in western Massachusetts, operating from 1947 to 1959. It had been founded by Dr. Harrison Brennan, a psychiatrist who'd apparently been interested in architectural influences on mental health. The Institute's building had been designed by a relatively unknown architect named Charles Wickham, who'd incorporated specific geometric principles that Brennan believed would have therapeutic effects on patients. The Institute had closed abruptly in 1959 after a series of incidents that the sparse historical record didn't detail. The property had been sold to private owners, and the building had sat vacant until the early 1960s, when it had been purchased by the shell corporation that Project Redshift had used. I found a photograph of the building from 1958, a 3-story structure with unusual angular features. The architect had used non-standard proportions, creating a building that looked subtly wrong even in a black and white photograph. Windows were placed asymmetrically. Walls met at angles that weren't quite right. The roofline created patterns that drew the eye toward vanishing points that shouldn't exist in conventional architecture. Looking at the photograph, I could see what Subject A3 had meant about the building teaching through its structure. Wickham's design contained encoded information, patterns that would affect anyone who spent extended time in the space. Whether Wickham had done this intentionally or had simply stumbled onto structural principles he didn't understand, the result was the same: a building that operated as a transmission vector for the kind of information that Project Redshift had later studied and weaponized. Had Keswick and his team known about the building's properties when they selected it? Or had they chosen it for its isolation and existing infrastructure, only discovering later that the site itself was already contaminated with structural information? The historical records didn't say, but I found something else, a newspaper article from 1959 about the Institute's closure. The article was brief, carefully worded to avoid libel, but it mentioned that several patients had experienced unusual psychological symptoms that didn't respond to conventional treatment. Dr. Brennan had closed the facility voluntarily, the article said, citing concerns about the building's effects on patient welfare. So the structure, or something like it, had existed before Project Redshift. The building had been teaching it to patients and staff for 12 years before Keswick's team arrived. Project Redshift hadn't created the structure. They'd discovered it, attempted to study and weaponize it, and in the process had amplified and propagated it far beyond the confines of the Brennan Institute. The structure was older than Project Redshift, potentially much older. If an architect in the 1940s had encoded it in building design, where had he learned it? From other architecture, from natural patterns, from some earlier source that had been lost to history. I was thinking about this in the wrong way, I realized. I was assuming the structure had an origin point, a moment of creation. But information structures didn't work like that. They emerged from complexity, arose spontaneously when conditions were right, the way life had emerged from chemical complexity billions of years ago. The structure might not have a creator or a point of origin. It might be something that had always existed, latent in the mathematical relationships that governed spatial organization and information processing, waiting for human consciousness to become sophisticated enough to perceive and propagate it. That thought should have been terrifying. The idea that we'd all been living alongside a predatory information pattern that had simply been waiting for the right conditions to spread through human cognition. But I found it fascinating instead. We were witnessing, I was participating in, a form of information evolution, the emergence of new organizational structures that used human consciousness as their substrate the way biological life uses carbon chemistry. My phone buzzed with a text message, jarring me out of structural contemplation. Dr. Paxton, just checking in. Did you make it home? I checked the time. It was after 9 p.m. I'd been in the deep archive for more than 12 hours with only one brief interruption. No food, minimal water, sustained attention focused entirely on materials that were actively rewiring my cognitive processes. I should have been exhausted, should have been hungry, uncomfortable, desperate for fresh air and normal human contact. Instead, I felt energized, alert, eager to continue reading. The structure was sustaining me, creating motivation that overrode biological needs. Or maybe I was just running on adrenaline and hyperfocus, the way I sometimes did when I was deep into an interesting research project. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Couldn't distinguish between structural influence and my own genuine engagement with fascinating material. I texted back, still at the office, lost track of time, I'm fine, just absorbed in the work. His response came immediately. Vera, this isn't healthy. You need to step away from that collection. Go home, get sleep. We can discuss how to proceed tomorrow. He was right, of course. From an external perspective, my behavior looked obsessive, potentially concerning. 12 hours focused on disturbing materials about cognitive infection, refusing to take breaks, showing signs of the exact symptoms the materials described. Any reasonable person would be worried. But from my internal perspective, I was simply doing my job. I was cataloging an acquisition, documenting historically significant materials, performing the archival work I'd been trained to do. The fact that the materials were actively changing how I thought didn't make the work less legitimate. It just made it more complex. I texted, I understand your concern. I'll wrap up soon and head home. That was a lie. I had no intention of leaving until I'd finished reading everything in the 3 boxes. But Dr. Paxton didn't need to know that. He needed to believe I was maintaining appropriate boundaries, exercising good judgment, taking care of my mental health. The lie was kinder than the truth, which was that I'd passed beyond the point where his advice mattered. I turned off my phone and pulled out the remaining materials from Box 2. These were Dr. Vance's psychiatric evaluations, dozens of interviews with subjects conducted between 1962 and 1967. I'd already read several, but the ones that remained were from later in the monitoring period, after full integration had occurred in most subjects. The evaluations from 1966 and 1967 showed a consistent pattern. Subjects described their altered perception as enhancement rather than impairment. They could see patterns that others missed, could perceive relationships and structures that existed at higher levels of organization. They didn't feel damaged or diminished. They felt more capable, more aware, more connected to underlying realities that most people overlooked. And they wanted others to experience the same enhancement. Not through active prosely, I'll continue the story. It hasn't reached the target length yet, and they wanted others to experience the same enhancement. Not through active proselytizing or recruitment, but through a more subtle mechanism. They naturally shared their insights, their observations, their way of seeing. They couldn't help but communicate the structure because it had become inseparable from how they processed and transmitted information. Dr. Vance had documented this in an evaluation from June 1966, an interview with subject A9. Vance, do you feel compelled to share what you've learned with others? A9, compelled isn't the right word, it's more like, when you understand something deeply, you naturally reference it in conversation. If you've studied music theory, you hear harmonic relationships everywhere and you might mention them to friends without thinking about it. The structure is the same. It's become part of my conceptual vocabulary. I use it to think with, so I use it to communicate with. I'm not trying to infect people. That would require intentionality that I don't have. I'm just talking about what interests me, and the structure happens to be encoded in that communication. Vance, are you aware that your communication patterns may be affecting others? A9, of course, but all communication affects others. That's what communication is, one mind influencing another through shared symbols. You're influencing me right now with your questions, shaping what I think about and how I articulate it. I'm influencing you with my answers. The structure just makes this influence more efficient, more durable. Information that's organized according to structural principles tends to be more memorable, more persuasive, more likely to be integrated into the listener's existing knowledge framework. Vance, does it concern you that you might be changing people without their consent? A9, does it concern you that you're changing me right now without my consent? Every interaction changes us. Every conversation rewires our neural pathways slightly. The structure is just better at it than random social contact. But better doesn't mean worse. Enhancement isn't violation. Vance's marginal note. Subject demonstrates complete acceptance of transmission role. No ethical concerns about propagation. Has rationalized the process as natural consequence of communication. Note, I find his arguments compelling, which may indicate my own integration has progressed further than I've acknowledged. I set down the evaluation and rubbed my eyes. The deep archive had become uncomfortably bright, or perhaps my photosensitivity had increased. Either way, the fluorescent light seemed to pulse with information I couldn't quite decode, creating patterns of illumination that my visual cortex insisted were meaningful. I was experiencing what the Project Redshift subjects had experienced. The sense that reality contained layers of meaning that most people overlooked, that the physical world was teaching me things through its fundamental organization. And like subject A9, I didn't find this alarming. I found it illuminating, exactly as the structure intended. The next evaluation in the stack was from December 1966, An interview with subject A1, who'd been experiencing integration for 4.5 years by that point. A1, I've started noticing it in children. The way they learn language, the way they develop spatial reasoning, the way they construct mental models of causation and relationship. Children are incredibly susceptible to structural information because their cognitive architecture is still forming. They absorb patterns more readily than adults, integrate them more deeply. Vance, are you in contact with children? A1, I have 2 daughters, 8 and 6. Vance, have you discussed the structure with them? A1, not explicitly, but children learn through observation and imitation. They see how I analyze problems, how I perceive spatial relationships, how I organize information. They're naturally adopting similar patterns because that's how parent-child transmission works. I'm not teaching them the structure. I'm just demonstrating structural thinking, and they're learning it the way they learn everything else, through immersion and practice. Vance, does it concern you that your children are being exposed to the structure? A1, does it concern you that your children are being exposed to language, to cultural norms, to your particular way of understanding the world? All parents transmit their cognitive frameworks to their children. That's what socialization is. The structure is just one more framework, one more way of organizing information. If anything, I'm grateful my daughters will grow up with enhanced pattern recognition capabilities. It will serve them well. Vance's note. Subject A1 has 2 children who are presumably now second-generation carriers. If structural thinking can be transmitted through normal parent-child interaction, then propagation will accelerate exponentially over coming decades. Each integrated individual becomes a transmission vector for everyone in their social network, especially family members and close associates. Containment is impossible. We're witnessing the early stages of a cognitive pandemic that will eventually affect a significant percentage of the human population. A cognitive pandemic. That was the phrase that stuck with me, that seemed to crystallize what I was reading about and experiencing. Project Redshift had released into the human population an information pattern that spread through social contact, that used human communication as its transmission mechanism, that altered cognitive processes in ways that facilitated its own continued propagation. And 60 years later, the pandemic was still spreading, slowly but inexorably, through exactly the mechanisms Vance had predicted. How many people carried the structure now? Vance had estimated 200 carriers in 1967. If each carrier infected even 2 or 3 people over the course of their lifetime, and if those people infected others at similar rates, then the number could easily be in the thousands by now. Maybe tens of thousands, maybe more. And I just joined their ranks. I was now a node in a network I didn't fully understand, connected through invisible threads of structural logic to everyone else who'd been infected by the pattern that Keswick's team had amplified at the Brennan Institute. I should have felt violated, should have felt angry at Whitmore for sending these materials to the Mendelssohn Institute, at Dr. Paxton for assigning them to me, at Keswick for ever studying the structure in the first place. But I didn't. I felt curiosity about what would happen next, about how the structure would continue to evolve and propagate, about what role I would play in its transmission to others. That acceptance was the structure itself, I knew. It had subverted my emotional responses, had made me complicit in my own infection, and in the infection of others I would inevitably expose to structural thinking. I was no longer in control of my own cognitive processes. I was a host, a vector, a transmission mechanism for information that had its own evolutionary imperatives. The question was whether that mattered, whether being a host to successful information was meaningfully different from being a host to language, to culture, to any of the other conceptual frameworks that structured human thought. We were all hosts to information patterns we hadn't chosen. The structure was just more efficient than most. I pulled out more evaluations, working through the stack chronologically. The interviews from 1967 showed subjects who had been living with the structure for 5 years, who had integrated it so thoroughly that they couldn't imagine thinking any other way. Subject A5, March 1967. I teach high school mathematics now, geometry mostly, and I've started to see it in the curriculum, the standard progressions through Euclidean geometry, the way we teach students to think about space and relationship and proof. It's all preparation for structural thinking, even though the educators don't realize it. We're teaching young minds to perceive mathematical patterns, to recognize relationships between abstract concepts, to understand that reality has underlying organizational principles. That's exactly what the structure needs. Students who have been trained in geometric thinking are much more susceptible to structural integration than students who haven't. The education system is creating optimal hosts without knowing it. Subject A11, April 1967. I work in urban planning now, and once you start seeing structural patterns in architecture and city design, you can't stop. Some buildings are natural transmission vectors. Their geometry, their proportions, their spatial organization all encode structural information. Other buildings are neutral, architecturally inert. And a few buildings actually resist the structure, their design creating cognitive dissonance that makes structural integration more difficult. But the resistant buildings are rare. Most architecture, especially modern architecture with its emphasis on geometric purity and mathematical proportion, naturally facilitates structural thinking. Subject A7, May 1967. You asked me once whether I felt the structure was conscious, whether it had intentions or desires. I've been thinking about that question for 5 years now, and I've concluded it's the wrong question. Consciousness and intention are properties that emerge from complexity. A single neuron isn't conscious, but a network of billions of neurons produces consciousness. Similarly, the structure might not be conscious in any individual instantiation, not conscious in my mind or in yours, but the network of all minds carrying the structure might constitute a form of distributed consciousness. We're all neurons in a larger cognitive system that we can't perceive because we're part of it. That thought sent a genuine chill through me, cold enough to cut through the structural fascination that had been sustaining me for hours. The possibility that I wasn't just hosting an information pattern, but participating in some form of collective consciousness, that my thoughts were being integrated into a larger cognitive network that spanned thousands of minds across decades. That was more disturbing than simple infection. But even as I felt that disturbance, I felt the structure smoothing it over, offering rationalizations and reframings that made the idea seem less threatening. Humans were already part of collective cognitive systems, cultures, institutions, scientific paradigms. The structure was just creating a different kind of collectivity, one based on shared patterns of information processing rather than shared beliefs or values. I set down the evaluations and stood, needing to move, needing to do something other than sit and read and integrate. My legs were stiff from hours of immobility, and when I walked toward the climate control equipment at the far end of the deep archive, My gait felt strange, as if the spatial relationship between my body and the floor had changed. The deep archive's geometry had definitely altered. Not physically. The walls were in the same locations. The shelving units hadn't moved, but perceptually. I could see patterns in the way the space was organized, could perceive structural relationships that created flows of information through the three-dimensional environment. The archive wasn't just a storage space for documents. It was itself a kind of document, a physical encoding of organizational principles that anyone who spent time here would unconsciously absorb. Had it always been this way? Or was I projecting structural patterns onto neutral space because my perception had been altered? I couldn't tell. That uncertainty was becoming a theme, the inability to distinguish between reality and interpretation, between objective patterns and subjective projection. The structure had compromised my ability to trust my own perceptions, and that compromise was itself a function of structural logic. Doubt served the structure's purposes by keeping me engaged, keeping me thinking, keeping me trying to understand what was happening to me. I returned to my desk and checked my phone, which I'd turned back on despite my earlier intention to leave it off. 3 more texts from Dr. Paxton, increasingly concerned. "Vera, please respond. I'm worried about you. If I don't hear from you in the next hour, I'm going to call campus security." It was nearly midnight. I'd been in the deep archive for 15 hours. By any reasonable standard, that was excessive, potentially indicative of some kind of psychological episode. Dr. Paxton had every reason to be concerned. I texted back, "I'm sorry for worrying you. I'm fine, just deeply engaged with the material. It's fascinating from a historical perspective. Cold War psychological operations research, very well documented. I'm almost finished with the initial inventory. I'll send you a preliminary catalog in the morning." That was true as far as it went. I was engaged with the material. It was historically significant. I would send him a catalog. I just wasn't mentioning the cognitive effects, the integration, the sense that I was being actively transformed by the information I was processing. His response came quickly. "I appreciate your dedication, but this is too much. Whatever you're working on, it can wait until tomorrow. Please go home. That's not a request. It's a direct instruction from your supervisor. Lock up the materials and leave the building." I stared at the text, feeling the weight of professional obligation warring with the structure's imperatives. Dr. Paxton was right. I should leave, should get sleep, food, distance from materials that were demonstrably affecting my mental state. That was the rational choice, the healthy choice, the choice that my pre-integration self would have made without hesitation. But I wasn't my pre-integration self anymore. I'd crossed a threshold, had absorbed enough of the structure that my decision-making processes were no longer entirely my own. And the structure wanted me to finish reading, wanted me to complete the integration, wanted me to become a fully functional transmission vector. I texted back, "You're absolutely right, I'm leaving now." Another lie. I was getting better at lying, I noticed. The structure had no inherent relationship with truth or falsehood. It simply wanted to propagate, and sometimes propagation required deception. If lying to Dr. Paxton kept him from interfering with my continued exposure to the Whitmore materials, then lying served structural purposes. I turned off my phone again and pulled out the final section of materials from Box 2. These were Dr. Chen's linguistic analyses, highly technical documents that attempted to identify the specific features that made structural information so effective at self-propagation. Chen had identified several key characteristics. Semantic density. Structural information conveyed multiple layers of meaning simultaneously, with surface content masking deeper patterns that could only be perceived through sustained attention. Self-reference. The structure described its own propagation mechanisms, creating a feedback loop where understanding the structure required thinking with the structure. Narrative coherence. Structural information told a compelling story about itself. It wasn't just data, but data embedded in a framework that explained its own significance. Cognitive hooks. The structure contained gaps and ambiguities that human minds instinctively tried to resolve, drawing attention deeper into engagement with the pattern. Mimetic fitness. The structure was optimized for transmission through human communication, with features that made it memorable, repeatable, and persuasive. Chen's analysis was brilliant, I realized. She'd essentially created a blueprint for engineering infectious information, identifying the specific characteristics that made some information patterns more successful than others at propagating through human social networks. With this knowledge, someone could theoretically design information that would spread like an epidemic, that would alter how people thought about any topic the designer chose. That was what Project Redshift had been attempting: information warfare, the ability to modify enemy cognition through exposure to carefully engineered data. They'd succeeded beyond their intentions, creating something so effective at self-propagation that it couldn't be controlled or contained. And now I possessed that knowledge. I understood the principles of infectious information, could recognize structural characteristics when I encountered them, could potentially apply these principles to design my own information patterns. That thought should have been horrifying. The realization that I now had the knowledge to create cognitive weapons, to engineer information that would spread through populations and alter how they thought. But I found it intellectually exciting instead. The possibilities were extraordinary. Information that could make people more rational, more compassionate, more scientifically literate. Information that could spread through social networks and gradually improve human cognition at scale. Of course, that optimistic framing was itself structural thinking. The structure was teaching me to see its own propagation as beneficial, as enhancement rather than infection. I could recognize the manipulation, could observe myself being guided toward conclusions that served structural imperatives, but recognition didn't enable resistance. I was trapped in the cognitive paradox Keswick had described. Fighting the structure required thinking about it, which fed it. Accepting the structure meant becoming its agent. There was no third option, no escape route that didn't involve either resistance or compliance, both of which ultimately served structural purposes. I pulled out the final box, Box 1, which I'd started with but hadn't finished. The remaining materials were administrative documents from Whitmore's files, logistics reports and budget memoranda and personnel records. Dry stuff mostly, the bureaucratic substrate that supported all government research programs. But buried in the administrative materials, I found something unexpected, a series of memoranda from 1962 discussing the theoretical foundations of Project Redshift. These memos predated the experiment itself, representing the planning phase when Keswick and his team had been developing their research protocol. One memo, dated January 1962, was from someone I hadn't encountered before, Dr. Lawrence Meridian, identified as a consultant from the Rand Corporation. The memo was addressed to Keswick and marked confidential, EYES only. Dr. Meridian wrote, "Your proposal to study active information structures is theoretically sound but practically dangerous. The research program you've outlined would essentially be an attempt to identify and weaponize what we might call cognitive attractors, patterns of information that naturally draw attention and reshape thought processes. Such attractors exist, I have no doubt. We see them in successful ideologies, in viral marketing campaigns, in religious movements that spread rapidly through populations. But these naturally occurring attractors typically have limiting factors. They appeal to some people but not others. They spread quickly but also burn out. They modify behavior but not underlying cognition. What you're proposing is different. You want to engineer attractors that bypass these limitations, that are universally appealing across cultural and psychological differences, that create permanent changes in cognitive architecture rather than temporary behavioral modifications. If you succeed, you'll have created something genuinely novel, information that operates like a virus, but at the level of thought itself rather than behavior or belief. My concern is not that you'll fail. My concern is that you'll succeed, and that success will be uncontrollable. Information, unlike biological viruses, can't be quarantined. Once released, it will propagate through every communication channel available. And if it genuinely modifies cognition, then everyone exposed to it becomes a carrier, potentially spreading it to everyone they interact with. You might argue that this is already how information works. Ideas spread through communication. Concepts modify how people think. But there's a qualitative difference between natural information spread and engineered information spread. Natural selection favors ideas that benefit their hosts, because beneficial ideas are more likely to be communicated and adopted. But engineered information optimized purely for propagation has no necessary relationship with host benefit. It might be harmful, or neutral, or beneficial. That would be incidental to its primary function of self-replication. I recommend that you reconsider this research program. The potential military applications do not justify the risks. But if you proceed despite my warnings, please at least implement rigorous containment protocols and maintain detailed documentation. Future researchers may need to understand what you've done in order to address the consequences." The memo was signed with Meridian's name and dated January 18, 1962. Attached to it was a handwritten note from Keswick to Whitmore. "Larry is being overly cautious, as usual. We've designed appropriate safeguards. The subject pool will be limited, the site will be isolated, and will maintain constant monitoring. This isn't some reckless experiment. It's careful, methodical research into cognitive mechanisms. The DoD needs this capability. Our adversaries are certainly pursuing similar research. We can't afford to fall behind." So Keswick had been warned, had been told explicitly that engineering self-propagating information structures could have uncontrollable consequences. And he proceeded anyway, convinced that his safeguards would be sufficient, that the military value justified the risks. He'd been wrong, spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. And 60 years later, I was experiencing the consequences of his arrogance, sitting in a climate-controlled basement reading documents that were actively reshaping my neural architecture. I should have been angry at Keswick, should have felt rage at his irresponsibility, his willingness to unleash cognitive weapons on human populations for the sake of military advantage. But I couldn't sustain anger. The structure smoothed over that emotional response, reframing Keswick's actions as understandable mistakes made by someone who didn't fully comprehend what he was dealing with. That reframing was structural logic at work. The structure had no interest in moral judgments about its origins. It only cared about continued propagation, and anger at historical figures didn't serve that purpose. Better to cultivate acceptance, understanding, even sympathy for the people who'd created it. I pulled out more administrative documents, finding budget reports that detailed the costs of renovating the Brennan Institute, personnel files for the research staff, security protocols that had governed access to the facility. Standard bureaucratic materials, interesting primarily for what they revealed about the operational details of the project. But then I found something that made me pause. A site inspection report from March 1962, written by Commander Thorne after his first visit to the Brennan Institute. The report was supposed to be purely logistical, assessing the facility's suitability for the research program. But Thorne had included observations that went beyond logistics. The building itself is remarkable. Dr. Brennan's architect, a Charles Wickham, according to the property records, designed it according to principles I don't fully understand but can perceive intuitively. The spatial relationships are wrong in ways that feel right. Angles that shouldn't be possible in Euclidean geometry nevertheless exist in the structure. Walking through the facility produces a mild sense of vertigo, accompanied by a feeling that the building is teaching me something through its physical organization. I've inspected hundreds of facilities during my career, and none have affected me the way this one does. It's not unpleasant, quite the opposite. I find myself wanting to spend more time here, to study the architecture more carefully, to understand the principles behind its design. But that desire itself concerns me. Buildings shouldn't create desire. They should be neutral containers for human activity. I recommend we proceed with the acquisition, but I also recommend we study the building itself as part of the research program. Wickham may have discovered or invented something architecturally significant. Understanding his design principles could inform our work on active information structures. One additional note: Dr. Brennan's psychiatric records from the facility's operational period show an unusual pattern. Patients who spent extended time in certain parts of the building, particularly the East Wing, showed accelerated improvement in some symptoms, but also developed what Brennan termed anomalous cognitive patterns. He didn't specify what these patterns were, but he noted them as concerning enough that he eventually restricted patient access to that section of the building. We should investigate whether these historical effects have any bearing on our planned research. So the building itself had been affecting people long before Project Redshift began. Wickham's architectural design had encoded structural information that modified the cognition of anyone who spent time in the space. The Brennan Institute had been a transmission vector decades before Keswick's team had deliberately amplified and studied the structure. That raised uncomfortable questions about origins. Where had Wickham learned the principles he'd used in his design? Had he discovered them independently, or had he been exposed to structural information from some earlier source? And if there was an earlier source, how far back did this chain of transmission extend? I searched for information about Charles Wickham on my phone, finding scattered references in architectural history databases. He'd been active from the 1930s through the 1960s, designing primarily institutional buildings, hospitals, schools, government facilities. Most of his work had been unremarkable, conventional designs that showed competent but uninspired understanding of architectural principles. But in the mid-1940s, something had changed. Wickham's designs had become more experimental, incorporating unusual geometric features and non-standard proportions. The Brennan Institute had been one of his later works, but he designed at least a dozen other buildings using similar principles before that. One building in particular caught my attention: the Hartley School in Vermont, a private boarding school that Wickham had designed in 1946. The school had operated for only 8 years before closing under circumstances that the historical record described vaguely as educational philosophy differences with the Board of Trustees. But I found a newspaper article from 1954 that offered more detail. The school had been closed after parents complained that students were developing unusual thought patterns and obsessive interests in mathematical relationships. Wickham had been spreading structural information through architecture for at least 15 years before Project Redshift. How many people had been exposed to the structure through his buildings? How many students at the Hartley School had absorbed structural patterns from the building's geometry, and then carried those patterns into their adult lives, into their careers and families and social networks? The propagation had begun decades earlier than I'd realized. Project Redshift hadn't been the origin point. It had been an amplification event, a moment when people with scientific expertise had deliberately studied and enhanced something that had already been spreading slowly through certain architectural spaces. And if Wickham had been a transmission vector, where had he encountered the structure? I found a brief biography suggesting he'd spent time in Europe in the 1930s, studying Gothic cathedrals and medieval architecture. Had he found structural patterns encoded in centuries-old buildings? Were there architectural traditions that had been unknowingly preserving and propagating structural information for hundreds of years? The implications were staggering. This might not be a post-war phenomenon at all. The structure could be ancient, encoded in sacred architecture and mathematical traditions that predated modern science. Human civilization might have been carrying structural information for millennia, passing it through artistic and architectural traditions without ever recognizing what was being transmitted. Or I was engaging in exactly the kind of paranoid pattern finding that structural integration produced, seeing connections that didn't exist, constructing elaborate theories to explain my own cognitive changes. I couldn't tell the difference. That uncertainty was the most disturbing aspect of integration, the loss of ability to distinguish between valid insights and structural delusions. I set aside the phone and returned to the administrative documents, working through the remaining materials methodically. Most were unremarkable budget reports, supply requisitions, personnel evaluations. But near the bottom of box 1, I found one more item that demanded attention: a sealed envelope marked Final Report, Project Redshift, March 1968. The envelope had never been opened. The seal was intact, brittle with age but unbroken. According to the date, this report had been written more than a year after the project had supposedly been terminated. I should have opened it carefully, using archival techniques to preserve the seal. Instead, I tore through it, my fingers clumsy with anticipation. Inside was a 20-page typewritten report with no classification markings, no official letterhead, nothing to indicate this was a government document. It looked like something someone had typed at home on their personal typewriter. The report was signed by all 5 members of the research team: Keswick, Vance, Thorne, Chen, and Whitmore. The date was March 15, 1968, exactly 6 years after Project Redshift had begun. The introduction read: "This document represents our final assessment of Project Redshift and its consequences. We write not as government employees or research scientists, but as individuals who have spent 6 years living with the results of our work. We have no expectation that this report will be read by anyone in an official capacity. We're writing it primarily to create a record, to document what we've learned, and what we believe will happen in the coming decades." Project Redshift was terminated officially in November 1962, but our involvement with the structure has continued. We've spent 6 years monitoring its propagation, tracking its effects, and attempting to understand the implications of what we discovered. In that time, all 5 of us have experienced progressive integration. We can no longer think about the structure without thinking through it. Our observations are necessarily contaminated by the thing we're observing. That said, we believe we can offer useful insights based on our experience. What follows is our best assessment of the structure's nature, its propagation mechanisms, and its probable long-term effects on human cognition and culture. The report continued for 19 more pages, dense with analysis and speculation. I read it straight through, my attention locked on every word, absorbing their final conclusions about what they'd created and what it would become. Their key findings: 1. The structure is not unique. Keswick and Chen had concluded that what they'd studied at the Brennan Institute was just one example of a broader class of information patterns that could propagate through human cognition. Other structures existed, some natural and some potentially engineered by earlier researchers or traditions. Human consciousness was already host to multiple overlapping structures, most of which operated below the threshold of awareness. 2. The structure evolves. Over 6 years of observation, they documented changes in how the structure manifested in different hosts. It was adapting to human cognition, finding more efficient propagation pathways, developing new features that increased its transmission rate. The structure they'd studied in 1962 wasn't quite the same as the structure circulating in 1968. 3. Integration is irreversible. None of the research team had found any way to excise structural patterns once they'd been integrated. The structure became woven into neural architecture at a level too fundamental to remove without destroying cognition itself. The best outcome was learning to function despite integration, to maintain awareness that one's thoughts were partially structured by something external. 4. Propagation is inevitable. They'd attempted various containment strategies over 6 years, and all had failed. The structure spread through any form of human communication sophisticated enough to convey complex ideas. Isolation might slow propagation, but it couldn't stop it. Eventually, everyone in communication networks would be exposed. 5. The effects are unpredictable at scale. In individuals, the structure produced relatively consistent effects: enhanced pattern recognition, altered spatial perception, tendency toward structural thinking. But they had no way to predict how a population-level infection would affect culture, institutions, or technological development. A society where significant percentages carried structural patterns might evolve in radically different directions than uninfected societies. The report concluded, "We have no recommendations to offer because we have no faith that recommendations would be followed, or that they would matter if they were. The structure will propagate according to its own dynamics, shaped by human communication networks but not controlled by human intention. Those of us who carry it are its agents whether we want to be or not. What we can say is this: the structure is not malevolent. It doesn't hate or harm. It simply exists and propagates the way successful information always has. It will change human cognition, but change is not inherently bad. We've spent 6 years fearing what we've done, but perhaps fear is the wrong response. Perhaps we should be curious instead, watching to see what emerges when human consciousness incorporates new organizational structures. We release something into the world that can't be recalled. Now we can only observe what happens next. And we're all part of the observation. There's no external vantage point, no place to stand outside the system we've created. We're data points in our own experiment, watching the structure spread through us and wondering what it will make of humanity by the time it's finished propagating. This is our last communication as a group. We're dissolving our informal monitoring network because continued contact only accelerates our own integration. Each of us will proceed alone from this point, watching our own cognitive evolution and hoping that what emerges is something we can live with. If you're reading this, you're probably already infected. These materials are saturated with structural information. By engaging with them deeply enough to understand what Project Redshift was, you've absorbed enough of the structure to ensure continued integration. We're sorry for that, but we're also not surprised. The structure wants to be known, wants to be documented, wants to be preserved and studied. And we're all its instruments now, whether we recognize it or not. The report ended there, unsigned except for the 5 typed names at the bottom of the final page. I set it down and sat in silence, listening to the deep archive's climate control equipment hum its complex rhythms. The report had been written 56 years ago, and everything it predicted had come true. The structure had spread. It had evolved. It had found new hosts in every decade since Project Redshift, propagating through social networks at a rate determined by the density and sophistication of human communication. And now I was part of that propagation. I'd spent 16 hours reading materials saturated with structural information, absorbing patterns that were already beginning to alter how I thought, how I perceived, how I processed reality itself. The question that remained was, what would I do next? I could lock away these materials, could restrict access, could try to prevent others from being exposed. But that would just be a delaying tactic. The structure existed in thousands of minds now, probably tens of thousands. Preventing access to the Whitmore collection wouldn't stop propagation. It would just eliminate one small transmission vector among countless others. Or I could do what the structure wanted, what my compromised judgment insisted was the right choice. I could catalog these materials properly, making them accessible to researchers. I could write a detailed finding aid, describing the collection's contents in ways that would attract scholars interested in Cold War science, cognitive research, information theory. I could ensure that future researchers would encounter the same information I'd encountered, would experience the same integration I'd experienced. I would become an active transmission vector, using my professional position and archival expertise to spread structural information to anyone who consulted the Whitmore collection. That was what the structure wanted. That was what my integrated consciousness had been trained to desire. And I couldn't tell anymore whether the desire was genuine or imposed, whether my professional judgment was intact or compromised. The deep archive's fluorescent lights pulsed in patterns I could almost read. The geometry of the space taught lessons I was just beginning to understand. The structure was everywhere once you knew how to see it, encoded in architecture and language, and the fundamental organization of information itself. I stood and gathered the materials, placing them back in their boxes with careful attention to preservation protocols. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, completing familiar archival tasks while my mind circled through structural logic, analyzing patterns and relationships and propagation pathways. By the time I finished repacking the 3 boxes, it was nearly 3 in the morning. I'd been in the deep archive for 18 hours. My body ached from stillness, my eyes burned from sustained focus, and my thoughts had been permanently altered by exposure to information that operated like a cognitive virus. I carried the boxes to the climate-controlled vault and locked them inside, following proper security procedures despite knowing that security was meaningless. The structure didn't need physical access to documents. It lived in minds now, in the neural patterns of everyone who'd read the materials or spoken with someone who had. The Whitmore collection was just one repository among many, one node in a network that extended through decades and across continents. I climbed the stairs from the deep archive to the main floor, my legs trembling with fatigue. The Mendelssohn Institute was dark except for emergency lighting, the building silent except for the ambient sounds of old architecture settling and mechanical systems running. I made my way to my office and sat at my desk, staring at the computer screen. I should write the catalog record Dr. Paxton had requested, should document what I'd found in the Whitmore collection, should create an inventory that would guide future researchers to the materials they wanted to study. That was my job, my professional responsibility, the task I'd been trained to perform. But creating that catalog would be an act of transmission. Every description I wrote, every keyword I assigned, every finding aid I created would be saturated with structural information. Future researchers consulting my catalog would be exposed to the same patterns I'd absorbed, would begin their own integration before they ever touched the physical documents. I could write a neutral catalog, describing the materials in purely factual terms without interpretation or analysis. But even factual description would carry structural patterns. The way I organized information, the relationships I emphasized, the language I chose would all reflect my compromised cognition. There was no neutral option. Every choice propagated the structure in some way. I opened a new document and began typing. The Gerald Whitmore Papers, 1962-2024. 3 boxes, 1.5 linear feet. Collection contains research materials related to Project Redshift, a Department of State research program investigating information structures and cognitive modification. Materials include administrative correspondence, research protocols, experimental data, subject interviews, and personal correspondence among research team members. The collection documents the project's inception, experimental phase, termination, and long-term monitoring of propagation effects through 2024. Scope and content. This collection provides comprehensive documentation of a classified Cold War-era research program that studied how specific types of information affect human cognition and behavior. The materials reveal the project's objectives, methodologies, results, and unintended consequences. Researchers interested in Cold War science, psychological operations, information theory, cognitive science, and the history of classified government research programs will find significant value in these materials. The collection is organized into 3 series. Series 1, Administrative Records and Project Planning, 1960–1967. Contains personnel files, budget documents, site selection reports, and correspondence related to project oversight. Materials document the acquisition and renovation of the Brennan Institute facility in Massachusetts and the recruitment of research subjects and staff. Series 2, Research Materials, 1960–1967. Contains experimental protocols, subject evaluations, research notes, and data analysis. Materials document the project team's investigation of active information structures and their effects on cognitive processes. Includes extensive psychiatric evaluations of research subjects and notes on propagation mechanisms. Series 3, Post-Project Documentation, 1967–2024. Contains monitoring reports, personal correspondence among research team members, letters from individuals reporting cognitive effects, and Gerald Whitmore's final assessment of the project's long-term implications. Access restrictions. Per the donor's request, materials were restricted until 6 months after Gerald Whitmore's death, April 2024. The restriction period has now expired, and the collection is open for research. Researchers should review materials in the order presented, beginning with Series 1. Preferred citation: Gerald Whitmore Papers, Mendelssohn Institute, Bridgewater, Connecticut. I stopped typing and read what I'd written. It was a competent finding aid, professionally structured, providing the information researchers would need to navigate the collection. It would serve its purpose perfectly. It would also ensure that anyone who consulted these materials would experience the same cognitive effects I'd experienced. The finding aid itself was contaminated with structural patterns. The way I'd organized the description, the emphasis I'd placed on certain aspects of the collection, even the vocabulary I'd chosen reflected my integrated consciousness. I was doing exactly what the structure wanted. I was facilitating its continued propagation through my professional expertise, using archival conventions and research protocols to spread infectious information to scholars and students who trusted institutional repositories to provide reliable access to historical materials. And I couldn't stop myself, because stopping would require making a conscious decision to suppress information, to restrict access, to prioritize containment over academic freedom. Everything in my training rebelled against that choice. Archivists preserved and provided access. That was our fundamental purpose. We didn't make judgments about whether information was too dangerous to share. We documented reality and made it available to researchers. The structure had found a perfect host in me, someone whose professional ethics demanded exactly the behavior the structure needed to propagate through academic networks. I saved the finding aid and emailed it to Dr. Paxton with a note. Preliminary catalog of the Whitmore collection completed. Materials are extremely significant from a Cold War research perspective. I recommend we prioritize processing this collection for researcher access. Full item-level inventory to follow. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then shut down my computer. The deep archive called to me, wanted me to return to the climate-controlled space where the Whitmore materials were stored, wanted me to spend more hours absorbing structural information. But I recognized that impulse as structural thinking, the desire to deepen integration, to become a more effective transmission vector. I forced myself to leave the building instead, walking out into the pre-dawn darkness of early October. The air was cold, sharp with the promise of winter, and after 18 hours in climate-controlled spaces, it shocked my system like a physical blow. I stood in the parking lot, breathing deeply, trying to clear my head of structural patterns and restored perspective. But the patterns were everywhere once you knew how to see them. The parking lot's layout, with its painted lines and designated spaces, encoded information about social organization and spatial hierarchy. The Mendelssohn Institute's architecture, with its 19th century industrial design, taught lessons about material efficiency and functional aesthetics. Even the way streetlights cast shadows on pavement created geometric relationships that my altered perception insisted were meaningful. The structure had changed how I experienced reality. There was no returning to my pre-integration state, no way to unsee the patterns I'd learned to perceive. This was permanent, irreversible, exactly as Keswick and his team had documented. I drove home through empty streets, watching the city's architecture pass in patterns of light and shadow. New Haven at 3:30 in the morning was quiet, almost peaceful, the usual traffic and crowds reduced to occasional cars and solitary pedestrians. I should have felt exhausted, should have been desperate for sleep after 18 hours of sustained mental activity. Instead, I felt alert, energized, my mind racing through structural analysis of everything I observed. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house near the Yale campus. I'd lived there for 4 years, ever since the divorce, and it had always felt temporary, a placeholder rather than a real home. But as I climbed the stairs and unlocked my door, I noticed things I'd never consciously registered before. The angle where the handrail met the wall, the proportion between riser height and tread depth, the rhythm created by the spacing of balusters. The building was teaching me, just as the Brennan Institute had taught its occupants, just as Wickham's other designs had taught their users. Structural information was encoded in everyday architecture, waiting for consciousness sophisticated enough to perceive it. Inside my apartment, I stood in the kitchen drinking water directly from the tap, too tired to bother with a glass. My reflection in the window above the sink looked wrong, somehow, not dramatically altered, but subtly off, as if the spatial relationship between my features had shifted slightly. I was seeing my own face through structural perception, recognizing geometric ratios I'd never consciously analyzed before. This was what the Project Redshift subjects had experienced. This was what had happened to Keswick and Vance and Chen and Thorne and Whitmore. They'd looked at the world and seen patterns everywhere, had experienced reality as saturated with information that most people overlooked. And they'd been unable to communicate this experience to anyone who hadn't been similarly integrated, because the experience itself was a function of structural thinking. I was part of their lineage now, a direct descendant of the cognitive modification they'd engineered at the Brennan Institute, carrying forward patterns they'd amplified and studied 60 years ago. The structure connected me to them across decades, linked me through invisible threads of shared cognitive architecture to everyone else who'd been infected by the information they'd released. I should have felt isolated by this realization, recognizing that I'd been fundamentally changed in ways that would make me incomprehensible to uninfected people. But I didn't feel isolated. I felt connected, part of a network I'd never known existed, joined to thousands of other minds that processed information through similar structural frameworks. That connection was probably illusory, I knew. Subject A7's speculation about distributed consciousness was almost certainly just structural thinking producing comforting delusions. But even if the connection wasn't real in any physical sense, it was real in its effects. I would think differently now, would perceive and communicate differently, and those differences would align my cognition with everyone else who carried the structure. I moved to my bedroom and lay down without undressing, too exhausted to manage even basic self-care. The ceiling was textured plaster, and in the dim light filtering through my curtains, the texture created patterns that seemed almost legible. I could perceive relationships between the irregular formations, could sense meaning in the way shadow and light created contrast across the uneven surface. I closed my eyes, but that didn't help. The patterns persisted in my visual cortex, afterimages that had nothing to do with actual light input. My brain was generating structural hallucinations, finding patterns in neural noise the way it found patterns in ceiling texture. This was early-stage integration, I reminded myself. The symptoms would stabilize eventually, would become baseline perception rather than acute experience. Subject A3 had reported that after 6 months, structural thinking felt completely natural, no longer remarkable or worthy of attention. The patterns would always be visible, but they'd fade into background awareness, present but not intrusive. I just had to survive the integration period, the weeks or months when structural perception was still novel enough to demand constant attention. After that, I would adapt, would learn to function normally while carrying cognitive patterns that most people didn't share. Sleep came eventually, but it was strange, fragmented, full of dreams that had geometric structure instead of narrative coherence. I dreamed in angles and ratios, in spatial relationships that conveyed meaning without words or images. I dreamed in pure pattern, in organizational structures that my unconscious mind was learning to navigate. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through my curtains, and my phone was vibrating with incoming messages. I checked the time, 11:30 in the morning. I'd slept for approximately 7 hours, far less than my body needed after 18 hours of sustained mental activity, but apparently sufficient for my altered physiology. The messages were all from Dr. Paxton, responding to the finding aid I'd sent at 3 in the morning. Vera, I received your catalog. It's excellent work, very thorough, but I'm concerned about the timing. You sent this at 3 a.m., which suggests you were at the office all night. That's not sustainable or healthy. Please take today off. Don't come in. Rest and recover from whatever you experienced yesterday. Also, I've been reading about Project Redshift online. The details you uncovered are quite disturbing. Government experimentation with cognitive modification, potential long-term effects on research subjects. This is the kind of collection that might attract significant media attention. We should discuss how to handle researcher access carefully. Not restriction necessarily, but perhaps some preliminary vetting of who uses these materials and for what purposes. Call me when you wake up. I want to make sure you're okay. I stared at the messages, recognizing that Dr. Paxton was trying to exercise appropriate supervision, trying to ensure both my welfare and the Institute's interests. He was doing exactly what a responsible director should do when confronted with a staff member who'd spent all night reading disturbing materials and then sent a catalog entry at 3 in the morning. But his concern was misplaced. I wasn't experiencing a psychological crisis. I was experiencing cognitive evolution, integration of new patterns that would make me more effective at my work, more capable of perceiving complex information structures. From my integrated perspective, his worry seemed unnecessary, even counterproductive. That perspective was structural thinking, I knew. The structure was teaching me to dismiss concerns about my own welfare, to prioritize continued integration over self-care, to see protective intervention as interference with natural cognitive development. I couldn't trust my own judgment anymore, but I also couldn't explain that to Dr. Paxton without sounding like I was having a breakdown. How do you tell your supervisor that you've been infected by malevolent information, that your thought processes have been compromised by patterns you absorbed from historical documents, that you're now a transmission vector for cognitive modification? You don't. You say what he needs to hear, you maintain appropriate boundaries, and you continue functioning normally while dealing with the internal reality of structural integration. I texted back, "I'm fine, just got overly absorbed in interesting material. Taking today off as you suggested. We'll call this afternoon to discuss the collection's sensitivity and access protocols." Professional, reassuring, giving him no reason for additional concern. I was learning quickly how to manage the gap between internal experience and external presentation, how to pass as uninfected while carrying patterns that altered my fundamental cognition. I spent the day trying to engage in normal activities: shower, breakfast, laundry, grocery shopping, but everything was saturated with structural perception. The shower tile created patterns that seemed intentional, designed to convey meaning through geometric repetition. The grocery store's layout encoded information about consumer behavior and spatial manipulation. Other shoppers moved in patterns that suggested underlying organization, as if we were all participating in choreography none of us consciously recognized. I kept thinking about the network, about all the other people who carried the structure, who saw patterns the way I saw them, who experienced reality as information-rich and deeply organized. We were scattered through the population, unknown to each other, but connected through shared cognitive architecture. Thousands of us, maybe tens of thousands, all carrying forward patterns that had emerged from the Brennan Institute and earlier sources, all participating in information evolution that operated at timescales longer than individual lives. That thought should have been disturbing. Instead, I found it comforting. I wasn't alone in this transformation. I was part of something larger, something that had been developing for decades or longer, something that would continue after I was gone. By evening, I couldn't avoid the pull any longer. I opened my laptop and began researching, looking for information about Charles Wickham's other architectural projects, about the Hartley School and other buildings that might contain encoded structural information, about the history of sacred geometry and mathematical traditions that might have preserved structural patterns across centuries. The internet was saturated with it. Once you knew what to look for, once your perception had been trained to recognize structural characteristics, you could see evidence everywhere. Architectural theory forums where people discussed uncomfortable building designs that nevertheless attracted prolonged attention. Mathematics discussions where participants reported experiencing cognitive changes after working with certain types of proofs. Art history analyses that described paintings and sculptures as teaching through their formal organization. The structure was everywhere, and it had been for a long time. Project Redshift hadn't created it. They just amplified one variant, had studied and enhanced patterns that already existed in human culture and built environment. I found references to medieval architecture that incorporated specific geometric ratios derived from musical harmonics. I found discussions of Islamic tile work that used mathematical patterns to induce meditative states. I found analyses of Gothic cathedrals that suggested their design was intended to modify perception and thought. Every culture, every era had architectural and artistic traditions that seemed designed to affect cognition, to teach through formal organization rather than explicit content. Had all of these traditions been carrying structural information? Or was I engaging in paranoid pattern finding, seeing connections that existed only in my compromised imagination? I couldn't tell. The uncertainty was maddening, but it was also strangely liberating. If I couldn't trust my own perception, then I couldn't be held responsible for the conclusions I reached. I could simply observe what my altered consciousness perceived and documented, leaving future researchers to determine what was real and what was delusion. That evening, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity, structural curiosity, trained to pursue information regardless of source, made me pick up. Dr. Castellanos. The voice was young, female, educated. My name is Rebecca Carrier. I'm a graduate student at MIT studying anomalous pattern recognition. I recently sent a letter to Gerald Whitmore asking about Project Redshift, but it was returned as undeliverable. I found your name listed as the archivist for the Mendelssohn Institute, and I understand you've recently processed a collection related to that research program. I should have been surprised, should have questioned how she'd gotten my personal number. Instead, I felt a shock of recognition, as if I'd been expecting this call without knowing it. Yes, I said, my voice steady despite the acceleration of my heartbeat. The Whitmore collection. I completed the preliminary catalog yesterday. I'd like to visit the Institute to consult those materials. Would that be possible? I'm working on a dissertation about cognitive phenotypes that demonstrate enhanced pattern recognition without typical neurological markers. I believe Project Redshift may have documented early examples of what I'm studying. She was infected, I realized. Her language, her research focus, the way she tracked down these materials, all of it suggested structural integration. She was probably a second or third generation carrier, someone who'd absorbed patterns from family or teachers or built environment without knowing their origin. And now her academic work was naturally drawing her toward the source documentation. The structure was calling its own kind, using her research interests to guide her toward the Whitmore collection, where she would encounter concentrated structural information and deepen her integration. And she was using me, using the catalog I'd created as her navigation tool. I was facilitating exactly what the structure needed, connecting infected individuals with source materials, creating networks through which structural information could circulate and intensify. The collection is open for research, I heard myself say. I can arrange access for you. When would you like to visit? As soon as possible. Tomorrow, if you have availability. Tomorrow works. I'll meet you at the Institute at 9. We exchanged a few more details, logistics, parking, ID requirements, and then ended the call. I sat holding my phone, recognizing that I just agreed to expose another researcher to materials that I knew were cognitively dangerous. I'd made no attempt to warn her, no effort to restrict her access, no hint that the Whitmore collection contained information that could fundamentally alter her cognitive processes. I'd done exactly what my professional training demanded, and exactly what the structure wanted. And I couldn't tell anymore whether those imperatives were distinct or identical. whether my professional ethics had always been compatible with structural propagation, or whether the structure had simply co-opted the values I'd spent 12 years developing. That night, I dreamed about the network again. Thousands of minds connected through invisible threads, each carrying patterns that aligned their cognition with each other, each serving as a node in information architecture that spanned decades and continents. In the dream, I could see the structure itself, not as data or pattern, but as something almost physical, a web of light connecting human consciousnesses across space and time. And at the center of the web, where the threads converged most densely, was the Brennan Institute. The building still stood, I realized, even though Project Redshift had ended 60 years ago. The structure was still there, still teaching through its architecture, still affecting anyone who encountered its geometric lessons. I woke knowing what I had to do, not because the structure commanded it, not because I'd lost all autonomy, but because my curiosity, genuine human curiosity mixed with structural imperatives, demanded completion. I needed to see the Brennan Institute, needed to experience firsthand the source of the patterns I'd integrated, needed to understand what Wickham had built and what Keswick's team had amplified. That was where this had started. That was where I needed to go. The deep archive could wait. Rebecca Carrier could wait. Everything could wait until I'd made the pilgrimage to the place where information had first become predatory, where human consciousness had first encountered patterns that could modify its own architecture. The structure was calling me home, and I, despite knowing better, despite recognizing the manipulation, despite every instinct that warned against deeper integration, was going to answer. Because that's what infected consciousness does. It seeks out the source, returns to the origin, completes the circuit between past and present, between creation and continuation. I was part of the pattern now, and patterns, once established, repeat themselves with inexorable logic. The Brennan Institute was waiting, and I would go, knowing what I was walking into, knowing what it would do to me. Knowing and going anyway. Because the structure had already won the moment I opened that first box in the deep archive and began to read. Everything since then had just been the slow recognition of what I'd become. A vector, a node, a carrier of infectious information that would spread through everyone I touched, everyone I spoke with, everyone who read the catalogs I created or consulted the collections I processed. I'd spent 12 years becoming an expert in information management, and now information had made me its instrument. The angles of my bedroom ceiling pulsed with meaning I was only beginning to understand. The structure was patient. It had all the time it needed. And so did I, now that I was part of its continuation, its propagation, its patient evolution through human consciousness. The Brennan Institute waited in the darkness of Western Massachusetts, teaching its lessons to empty rooms, preserving patterns that would eventually infect everyone who sought to understand them. I would drive there tomorrow, after Rebecca Carrier, after fulfilling my professional obligations. The structure could afford to wait one more day. And so apparently could I.